Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be doing my predictions for the 2025 F1 season drivers championship. And then after that, I guess we can have a bit of a look at the constructors as well based on those results. So 3 days of winter testing. I think we learned some things about the pecking order, but I do think that realistically, until we get into the first 5 to 6 races of the season, it's going to be tough to make, a really solid order from 1 through 10 in the constructors. But that being said, based on what we saw over those 3 days, and again, a little bit based on what we kind of know based on last year, I'm going to be making my season predictions from 1 through 20 in the Drivers' Championship. So I think starting out with number 20, not much of a surprise. I'm going to go with Gabriel Bortoleto. Now, if you watched my video the other day ranking the 2025 F1 grid, I don't think Gabriel Bortoleto is a particularly bad driver. I expect, if I did that ranking again at the end of the year or even next year, I would expect he would rise, quite a few spots. But the reality is that he's going to be driving a Sauber, and that car is likely going to be the worst car on the 2025 F1 grid. Not sure if it's even going to be better than last year's car. According to the race, they were saying that it's better than 2019 Williams, but unfortunately, 2019 Williams is an extremely low bar, and given that Bortoleto is a rookie, doesn't have a ton of testing going into the season, I think 20th is about what you would expect. And so number 19, I have his teammate Nico Hulkenberg. Now, normally I would not usually put two drivers just right beside each other. Surely there's going to be, a couple odd races here and there. Hulkenberg's a pretty solid driver. Surely he's going to be able to get, be ahead of some other driver. But honestly, based on what Sauber did in preseason testing, that car was not good, and I honestly think that Hulkenberg is really going to struggle to get any points out of that car this year. But of course, we shall see. So that leaves the other 9 teams and 18 drivers. And I think realistically, there's the top 4 teams, and then there's everyone else. There's some teams I think are going to be a bit consistently towards the front of the midfield group, and I think there's going to be some teams who are consistently towards the bottom. But I think it's a very, very fluid group from teams 5 through teams 9. And I do think that there's going to be some pretty big gaps between teammates, just because those teams are going to be very, very close together, I think, on pace. So number 18, I'm going to go with Isack Hadjar. I do think that in the midfield, and I think on the 2025 grid, I do think he's the weakest driver as of this point. I think that the Racing Bulls is an okay car, not fantastic. But I don't think it will. It's definitely, I think, step up from the Sauber, but I definitely don't think it's particularly stronger than the Aston, the Haas, or even the Alpine and the Williams. So I think it's kind of in the middle. They're not really, strongly, stronger, but not particularly bad either. And as a result, I do think that drivers' ability is going to play a large part in this part of the video. And as a result, I think, Hadjar, I think 18th is a reasonable spot to predict for him. Number 17, I'm going to go with Lance Stroll. I'm not expecting big things from Aston Martin, and I'm not expecting big things from Stroll either. When Aston struggled quite a bit the last half of last season, Stroll didn't get any points in the last 12 races or so. And so if this is where Aston are going to be this year, about 7th, 8th, most weekends, Alonso's able to get a couple points here and there. I think, Stroll's going to be struggling quite a bit to get any points. And so as a result, and given the fact that he seems to have gotten worse, I would say the last 3 to 4 years, the motivation doesn't really seem to be there. I'm predicting him to finish 17th in the championship. All right, moving on to number 16, I'm going to go with Oliver Bearman. For Bearman, again, kind of similar to Hadjar. I think, as a rookie, especially for looking at race pace, looking at the Drivers' Championship, I do think he's going to struggle a bit there, as most rookies would. Haas, I think, have had an okay preseason test. And I do think I think Bearman has enough potential there that I can definitely see him finishing ahead of Stroll, even if the cars are relatively closely matched on pace. But again, I have him below his teammate, which I think makes some decent sense. All right, moving on to number 15, I'm going to go with Jack Doohan. Now, again, recording this video, I'm assuming Doohan's just going to complete the entire season. And if not, I guess you could add up Doohan if his potential replacement Colapinto's points totals, and if that's 15th, then I guess that would be about right. But for doing, I think the Alpine looks like a pretty handy car, arguably 5th fastest, maybe 6th fastest. Very, very close between themselves and Williams. So I do think he has a decent car under him, which is why I think, assuming he does the full season, I think he can definitely finish ahead of Behrman, ahead of Hadjar, and ahead of Stroll. Now, number 14, I'm going to go with Tsunoda. This is the first lead driver from, I guess, what we're calling the midfield group for this year. And for Tsunoda, I think he'll have a solid year, decent driver. I don't think he will, outperform the car. I know it's a terrible expression because you can never really outperform the car. You can just get the most out of it. But for Tsunoda, I think he'll be solid. And I think he'll definitely be the better of the two Racing Bulls driver. And I would expect that even if the car's, for example, slightly worse than the Alpine, slightly worse than the Haas, I would expect him to beat both Doohan and Behrman. Now, number 13, I'm going to go with Fernando Alonso, and while it's very unfortunate and it hurts me deeply to see Fernando Alonso down in 13th, I simply think that Aston just don't have that good of a car. Last year, he was 9th in the championship, and I think if you took his results from just the second half of the season, probably doesn't finish in the top 10 either. So again, looking at 11th, 12th place from that second half of last year, again 13th isn't that far off. And I think for Alonso, the race pace racecraft is excellent as always. Qualifying, I think, will be a little bit of a struggle. Again, he doesn't really have a great benchmark, given that we know that Stroll is such a poor qualifier. But that being said, for Alonso, I think he'll get the most out of the car in the races, and I think for that reason, I think he'll be enough to get him ahead of Tsunoda in the championship. Now, number 12, I'm going to go with Esteban Ocon. For Ocon, I think Haas, again, will be a solid car. And again, I kind of rehashed a lot of these points in my video earlier this week, ranking the 2025 grid. But, for Ocon, solid qualifier, solid race pace. I think he'll do about what what you would expect a midfield driver to do in that car. And I do expect him to be a bit ahead of Behrman. I do think the Haas is going to be a little bit stronger than the Aston Martin, just given what we've seen. While the headline times for Haas were not particularly strong from testing, they did a run plan that was very, very similar to what they did the year before and had really strong results, I would say. So I expect the one lap pace to be much stronger than what they showed in testing. So I think for 12th, it's a pretty reasonable spot for Ocon. Now, number 11 is the first of the Williams drivers, and that is Albon. So for Albon in 11th, I think that's a reasonable spot. I don't really expect him to be ahead of Sainz, but I do think that if Williams are going to be the best, 5th, 6th best car, I think, Albon should do a pretty solid job. So I think 11th place is a good spot for him. Number 10, I'm going to go with Pierre Gasly. Now for Gasly, again, this is kind of hinging on the fact that Alpine are maybe not the best 5th best car, but they're maybe the 6th best at, say, 2/3 of tracks and 5th best at 1/3 of tracks. I think if that's the case, I think Gasly's shown enough in the last couple of years that, he can definitely do a very, very good job when the car's in that right spot. And so I do think there's a good chance that he could finish ahead of Gasly, especially given that he's going to be the lead driver of the team. And I don't expect Doohan to really finish ahead of him that often. Whereas for Albon, I think on weekends where Williams will have that 5th best car, he's also going to have to compete directly with his teammate Sainz. So I do think that could, unfortunately hurt him as well. I think as well, Albon, again, has, I think, benefited from having such weak teammates last 3 seasons. And I think Sainz is going to be a very, very stiff test for him. So having Gasly ahead of Albon, I think, if what we saw at winter testing comes to pass, I think, Gasly finishing 10th, I think is a pretty solid result for him. Now, the last of our midfield drivers, I think not a surprise at this point, is Carlos Sainz. I have him in 9th, best of the rest, I guess we should say. And I think even if Williams have a car that's level or a little bit worse than the Alpine, I think Sainz has been such a strong driver the last 4 years that I would expect him to be the best driver in the midfield by, a fair margin. I think between him, Gasly, Hulkenberg, Hulkenberg's going to be on his own, unfortunately, but between him, Gasly, and I would say Alonso, I think it's being very, very close between those drivers. But I think, if the car is decent, 5th best car, 6th best car, I expect him to get, really solid points almost every week, and I think is possible for Sainz. So now we move into the top 4, and this is kind of where things get a bit interesting. Based on what we saw from testing, I think things look very, very close. McLaren, perhaps the fastest car, perhaps not, but I think nonetheless pretty close between the other three teams. So number 8 in the Drivers' Championship, and I do think that there's going to be a bit of a gulf. I would be extremely surprised if any of the drivers that we've already looked at finish above 8th in the championship, unless we had some kind of fluke injury where a driver missed a significant amount of time. But nonetheless, I think it's going to be a top 8 group, and then basically everyone else, and then perhaps the two Saubers, 19th and 20th. So number 8, I'm going to go with Liam Lawson. Now, I don't think Lawson's going to have a bad season. I just don't think that Red Bull have built a particularly strong car this year, and I do think it's a car that's probably a little bit worse than what we saw last year. And again, I know Perez finished 8th in last year's car, but again, that was a car that was the best by a significant margin for the first quarter of the season. And so for Lawson, I think, even if you put all those drivers in equal machinery, maybe he finishes 7th ahead of Antonelli. But I think realistically speaking, it's going to be between him and Antonelli for being 7th and 8th if those cars are very, very evenly matched. If that the top 4 teams are evenly matched. For Lawson, I think qualifying is going to be a bit of a struggle, and it'll be really interesting to see, what the qualifying gaps are between the top 4 and teams 5 and 6, like Williams and Alpine. If there's a really big gap, on the level that we had, in the Big 3 era, similar to 2018, 2019, 2017, those years, don't think it'll hurt Lawson too much. But if qualifying gaps are very, very close, the Williams and the Alpine are, less than half a second off of the other team's pace, I think that can make life very, very difficult for Lawson if he, has some struggles in qualifying. I think he's going to do okay. I think he'll do better than Perez last year. In terms of points total, I think it will be hard. It really depends on the car. But if, let's say, Red Bull have the solidly 4th best car, I think 150, 160 points wouldn't be the end of the world if that is the case, even though that's exactly what Perez got last year. So number 7, I'm going to go with Andrea Kimi Antonelli. Now, Mercedes, I think, had a very, very good test. But the one caveat is that it was quite cold. And we know that the Mercedes last year were very, very good in those cold conditions. So, what happens when we get to warmer tracks? Do they repeat the same characteristics that we saw last year, where they would basically just lose performance, be the clear 4th best car, or have they overcome those inconsistencies, and are they truly perhaps the 2nd best team, or arguably very, very close to that best team on pace going into 2025? Very, very hard to say. For Antonelli as well, I think there's going to be quite significant growing pains. He's going to make mistakes. He's 18. It's his first season F1. Those things are going to happen, and I think, just having, for example, crashes or just off weekends on the races, it's very, very easy to lose, a bucket load of points just through that alone, even if he does have some very, very good weekends from time to time. So I think because of that, I do think, Mercedes likely a little bit better than Red Bull, but again, very, very close between the two of them. So because of that, I'm putting Antonelli in 7th ahead of Lawson, but could easily be the other way around. Now, number 6, I'm going to go with Lewis Hamilton. I know that might seem a bit of a surprise. I know lots of people on social media are going on and on about how Hamilton's going to get his 9th title. Yes, I did say 9th title. But I think reality is Ferrari, I do think, are, they're in the mix. I think they're definitely one of those top 4 teams, but I do think that the McLarens are likely a little bit stronger. And again, we saw this past year, we saw Russell, Hamilton equal machinery. We saw Russell came out on top there. We saw, if Verstappen's on equal machinery with the Ferrari, do we expect, Hamilton to beat him? I do think that there's going to be growing pains getting used to the Ferrari engine, getting used to the characteristics of the Ferrari. And I think Ferrari, again, this year's car, I do think it has some struggles. Again, we haven't really seen a wheel turned in anger yet, so it's hard to say for certain, but there were signs towards the end of the test that they, were not, a perfect car. So as a result, I do think Hamilton, I don't think he's going to really realistically challenge for the championship this year. He's I don't think he's the best qualifier in his own team. I do think that's going to be something that if those qualifying struggles continue into this season, I think it's something that's going to hurt him quite a bit in the Drivers' Championship if those top 4 teams are so close on pace. If he's consistently qualifying, the worst out of those 8 drivers, that's going to really hurt him because it's going to be much more difficult to move up, make up those positions if those cars are very, very close on pace. But again, we shall see in a couple weeks' time when we get a better idea of the pecking order. So number 5, I'm going to go with George Russell. I think that Mercedes, Ferrari should be very, very close on pace. And again, kind of like I alluded to before, we saw direct head-to-head with them in the same team last season. Russell came out on top mostly because of his far superior qualifying performance last year. And I do think, in that kind of scenario, again, wouldn't be a big surprise to see Russell come out on top again this year. I'm not entirely 100% sold on the Mercedes. I think it's a solid car, but I think that, again, like I said before with Antonelli, it did very, very well in cold conditions last year. But we haven't really seen what it'll do in warmer conditions, which I would say 75% of races are generally going to be above 22, 23 degrees Celsius. And that's kind of the temperature range where the Mercedes kind of start to struggle. And that temperatures for air temperature, track temperature, I know is much, much higher. For Russell, I know as well, I think his race pace, again, does have some question marks. The fact that Hamilton was able to regularly overcome such massive qualifying deficits this past season, even in past years, I think does suggest that, Russell doesn't quite have the race pace of some of the other top drivers. So I do think if the pecking order is very, very close between those top 4 teams, I do think it's something that could potentially hold them back a little bit. Now, number 4, I'm going to go with Charles Leclerc. Again, similar situation to what I said before. I think things are going to be very, very close between Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes, basically between positions 2 through 4 in the constructors. I do think, Leclerc's a very, very well-rounded driver, extremely strong qualifying, very strong in race pace, very strong racecraft as well. And so I think as a result, that will allow him to finish ahead of Hamilton. And if cars are relatively equal in pace, I think allow him to finish ahead of Russell. That being said, I don't think it'll be quite good enough to finish ahead in the 2 McLarens. If McLaren has a pace advantage of about, a tenth and a half in qualifying over the course of the whole season, I think realistically that's not going to be overcomable. And again, if that's persists into the races, assuming that they execute races a little bit better than they did last year, again, I think it'll be very, very hard to overcome that deficit. Now, into the top 3 in the championship, and I'm actually going to go with the first McLaren in third, and that is Oscar Piastri. Now, for Piastri, I think his second season F1 was definitely a step up from his first. This year will be really interesting to see how he gets on, especially if McLaren have the best car from the start of the season. Qualifying pace was a bit of a struggle in the sense that I think that Piastri lacks that really elite one-lap performance that allows you to get pole positions on a consistent basis. He obviously doesn't have a pole position yet, and he lost the qualifying battle 4-20 to Norris this past season. And I think, realistically, I think that if things are very, very close, I think that it could definitely affect Piastri negatively if he's, forced to consistently start outside of position, for example. Race pace, I think, is okay. He definitely had some inconsistency as well in his races. Last, quarter of the season, I think he struggled quite a bit at some of the tracks in the Americas, despite the fact that he was so strong earlier in the season during the European phase of the season. So it'll be really interesting to see how Piastri does in his third season of Formula One. But as you can see, there's one non-McLaren driver left, and again, we have 2 positions to go in our Drivers' Championship. So let's reveal those 2 positions, and I guess we'll discuss it a little bit. So number 2 in my prediction for the championship is Max Verstappen not winning a 5th consecutive championship, which of course number 1 has to be Lando Norris. So let's discuss this. So I think realistically, if McLaren have the best car for the whole season, again, qualifying gap of, let's say, a tenth of a second, race pace gap, similar margin, assuming that McLaren can actually execute races and execute race weekends a little bit better than they did this past season, with Lando Norris's natural qualifying pace, his race pace as well, I honestly think that it's going to be very, very tough for a non-McLaren driver to win the Drivers' Championship. I think at this point, Norris has shown last couple of years that he's definitely the stronger of the two McLaren drivers. So I think that Norris, assuming that he can learn from some of the mistakes, especially on the team side with strategy errors, race execution errors, I think that they should be able to execute races a lot better. And in my mind, I think this is kind of, it really feels like, Sebastian Vettel 2009 in Red Bull, very, very fast car. According to some of my analyses, the best car that year over the course of the whole season. But again, suffered a bit with execution, quite a few DNFs that year, some mechanical, some crashes. And then 2010, of course, won that first championship. And that kind of feels to me what the season could be for Lando Norris. A bit of a season of learning, maybe not the best result, maybe not the best feeling at the end of the year, but use that experience to really build over the winter and, create a successful title challenge in the following season. For Verstappen, I think it's going to be very, very tough for him under these conditions to defend his championship. Like I said, or I guess I don't think I've actually talked about this much, but I think if Verstappen is going to want to do a repeat of 2024 where he won the championship despite not having the best car for the whole season, he's going to need the pecking order to be very, very close. And so I think if McLaren is consistently the best car, and even if Verstappen is able to finish, let's say second, third, most weekends, that's going to end up being a situation like 2020. And still in 2020, didn't really come anywhere near the title because, Hamilton that season was winning most races, or even if he didn't win, he would still end up on the podium. And so I think I can definitely envision a similar situation this year where Verstappen is kind of the best driver in that kind of second group in the front. And basically you have both McLarens on the podiums for most races, and then as a result of, I think, Verstappen being quite a bit better than Piastri, a bit more consistent as well, he would be able to potentially nab that P2 in the Drivers' Championship off of Piastri. But I think in this kind of scenario, I don't expect the title fight to be close. Like, I think it would be, a title fight where, Norris would potentially win with maybe, a race or two to spare. So there you go. There's my predictions in the Drivers' Championship. Just, to conclude this video, just kind of go over what I would say the Constructors' Championship would be. So I would say clearly McLaren first. Second, I would probably go Ferrari. Third, Red Bull, and then fourth, Mercedes. But I think very, very close between teams 2, 3, and 4. Fifth in the championship, and I think based on what you can see pretty clearly here, I would put Williams in fifth. I think Alpine second driver issues, whether that's Doohan, whether that's Colapinto, I think will probably cost him too many points. And I think the lineup of Sainz and Albon is very, very tough. So again, it's not really, a slight against either of those drivers. I just think that the Williams lineup is very, very strong. After that, I would say probably Haas, and then Aston, and then Racing Bulls 7, 8, 9, and then I think unfortunately for Sauber, dead last for them. And again, I don't know if they'll be scoring any points this year. So there you go. There's my predictions for the 2025 F1 Drivers' Championship. I'm really looking forward to this season. Again, the season starts in about a week's time as of the uploading of this video. I think it'll be a very, very exciting championship. Hopefully, most weekends we go into them not really knowing who's going to win. So I'm kind of hoping that we don't have a repeat of a 2023 where, one driver, one team basically win all the races. So even if McLaren are the best car, I do hope that it's relatively close and that the other front-running teams and the other drivers, Verstappen, Leclerc, Russell and Hamilton are able to give them, pressure and give them a good challenge week in and week out. So there you go. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.